Thank you. So as you heard, I'm Alex. So just before I get started, just so I know what I'm dealing with here, who here actually has built an Ember app before or just knows a little bit about Ember? It's basically what I expected, like 3 people. You get used to this after a while. So normally I do a lot more talking about DOM performance and stuff like that, but today I'm going to cover a couple of things. I'll give you a brief intro to Ember and just tell you a little about what it is, why we like it, and why we think it's good for hybrid apps. Then I'll go a little bit into how we use Ember Cordova, which is a library I maintain, which basically just jacks Cordova into your Ember application as another build target. And with whatever time we have left, I'll go into some performance and DOM and stuff like that. If you're interested in the perf, just go and watch last year's PhoneGap Day talk, and a lot of it's in there as well. Steve did a good job. We don't need that anymore, and we don't need that anymore. So just to get started, why do we like using Cordova and Ember? The main reason is because Ember, which you're going to learn today. Otherwise, one of the really attractive things here is it's fantastic if you actually want your desktop, your mobile web, or your PWA and something working in PhoneGap. Because Ember is so structured, you can actually have targets that work for these 3 platforms. Sometimes we'll use Electron for desktop as well. But we can actually start to rip out the bits that we're not using. So you don't have the classic, everything hybrid problem where you have your desktop templates or responsive CSS that's not performant. I'm going to show you how all of that works. Last point before I jump in, and I make this every time, is that if you write good JavaScript, you'll typically get a good hybrid app. And I bring this up because every time we work with people, they tell us that PhoneGap or Cordova doesn't work very well. Then we go and look at their code, and it's the drizzling shits. Basically, if you're working on a desktop, you don't always write as much performant code, right? The machine is a bit more powerful, and you also just have a different expectation of what will work. So when we start putting animated dolphins, whatever you want to do across the screen in an app, it just doesn't look as good, it doesn't feel as good, and we discover that maybe our desktop app was never as good as we thought. So jumping into Ember, it's a self-described framework for ambitious applications. It's a JavaScript framework. Its heritage is actually in Sprout Core, if you remember Sprout Core. And you'd find a lot of the early adopters were Rails developers who wanted to move to the front end. So if you know Rails, Ember will make a lot of sense. It will be very familiar, and it almost works the same way, but for JavaScript in the front end. So we like it because it's very organized and it's very structured, which I'll show you. And what's great about that is every single Ember app looks exactly the same. So I work across 10, 12 different apps every year, and I can basically just transpose into a new app within 20 minutes, 30 minutes of figuring out what it actually does. We don't have the process you see in some other frameworks of needing to say, well, how do you handle a build? Where have you put things? How have you philosophically decided to approach it? Ember is very uniform. We all do it the same way. Last point on Ember, if you haven't seen it, we actually follow an LTS release cycle. So what this means is that every 12 weeks is an LTS release. Those are basically guaranteed to give you a sane upgrade path, and it's typically every 4 minor versions as well. So if you don't need the features, it's pretty good to stay on the LTS release train of Ember. The nice thing about that is you can actually time when you need to do your upgrades as a team. The other nice thing is if you're having problems, everybody in Ember is upgrading at the same moment. So you don't go through the same problems of delayed going through and upgrading, say, from Angular 1 to 2, and then doing it 6 months after everybody else and trying to find out how did people fix that problem. So to jump in, just to show you how we initialize an Ember app, it's pretty simple. Our CLI is actually first class, so we just go in and do Ember new. In this case, I decided to initialize with yarn just because I had low bandwidth, and I still had low bandwidth, so I didn't have time to finish the video. But that initializes our default Ember project. And just to show you what that looks like really quickly, we come in, it's given us an app directory. Let me scroll this to where you can see it. I'll make that bigger. So don't worry about the code, but what you can see is that it's given us a basic structure there with our app. We have our components, our controllers, our router. That's all being initialized. And this is the structure that you don't deviate from. Ember expects you to work this way, and you'll get a lot out of the box if you do work this way. So I'll go in and show you how that works now. So within that CLI as well, there are a couple of main things that we want to do. But First thing is we obviously have Ember build, just like any other thing, which will take our assets, it will generate a compiled version that you can put behind Nginx. You can use a Lightning deploy, whatever you want to do. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to boot the development server. So we type in Ember S. We're just going to go to localhost. It's a little bit slow again, just because I was doing a screen recording at the same time. And just straight out of the box, without having read any code, we have our basic Ember welcome page. So it's letting us know the server's working. Yarn's finished its install. We're ready to get going. You'll also notice we have this thing called the Ember Inspector. So I don't know whether you've seen something like this before. This has been around for maybe 2 years now. And what it lets us do is actually, through Chrome, go and inspect the internal workings of our app and what's going on. So you can actually see what routes are defined, what routes are active and what routes are not active, what data's been loading in. You'll see we even have render performance down there. We can see what promises have hung and are maybe leaking memory. And if you don't see, there's also deprecations there. So Ember is going to tell us if we're using a feature that's no longer part of the framework up front, which is really, really nice. Pardon? I didn't even realize Flux was on. There we go. That better? There we go. So the next thing we start to think about in Ember, I'm telling you all of this because I believe it's the best way to start structuring a hybrid app as well. The structure we're getting out of the box makes this really easy. So we start to think about our routes. So what I'm going to do is actually go through and just longhand, there are generators. Just go and create a route called users. And if you don't add anything else, it's going to assume that this URL is /users inside of our app. Then what I'm doing is I'm just creating a subroute called new. So we've defined /users/new. As I'm going through and creating the files, the important thing to understand in Ember is that routes actually nest. So if you're on a child route, all of the parent routes are active at the same time. And I'm going to show you why that's special, but we start to be able to do some really interesting data structures with that. So what I'm doing now is I'm just manually creating the new user route. You'll notice I followed the same file structure. You're required to do that in Ember because then it will automatically resolve and know what's going on for you. And in this case, I've just initialized an empty route. We're going to come back and put some more data in there in a second. And I'm just going to go and create the corresponding template as well. Imagine every route can have a template. It can also have a controller, which I'm not going to go into as much today. And just to show you that worked, we'll go to users new. And our new user page is right there down the bottom. If you're wondering why the welcome page is still there, that's that outlet thing I mentioned before, that every route is still active. So I'm going to go through and delete that now and just add in a basic header. So you can imagine this is how we start to structure our data and what's going on inside the application. But you may have noticed there's a bit of a problem with that structure already. And this is something we discovered when we were building bigger Ember apps, is that I had to go into 2 different parts of my app, into routes and into templates just to have a single thing. So you also have this structure called pods, which is something I really like. And what pods does is it lets us start to nest routes and templates together in terms of functionality. So you might have a users pod, which contains the users route, the users template, and a subcomponents directory for any components that only pertain to users. In my case, I find there are actually 2 types of components I'm always writing. Classic components, which are completely generic, and ones which I'm legitimately passing, say, a user model into. So in that case, I'll typically nest them under a user's pod because they're not independent components anyway. So what I'm going to do here is go through and create a pod with the same data we had before, and actually move that route into a pod because this is my default development structure. So you'll see we've done the same thing. We have pods, users new. I'm just going to move that route in. And then I'm also going through and moving the template as well. And what you're about to see is the naming of our files changes a little bit so we can use the Ember resolver. So instead of actually having template, as we go up, you'll notice there it's actually route.js and template HBS now. So the reason for that is that the Ember resolver knows how to go in, and we can still have our namespace folders. This one won't load because, again, Wi-Fi, you'll see it working on the next screen. So two other things I'm going to show you in Ember before we start talking about why this matters in hybrid. So like anybody, we have components. I'm sure everybody here has used components before. As I said, there are typically two types that I would use. And in this case, I'm just going to go through and create a basic component structure within pods. I'm just going to create a bullshit users component that's not going to do anything, but this way you'll get to see it working. So you're probably already noticing we go through, we create a folder, which is the name of the component that we want. And inside of that, I create a component.js, not a route.js. This is how Ember knows what it's actually dealing with. And we'll create the template. And what I'm doing up here, if you've never seen this kind of const equals Ember before, I'm not sure if that's common in other frameworks, but this is what we call deconstructing the namespace. We actually don't have proper tree shaking yet, so this is more of a developer courtesy that out of this massive Ember namespace, what am I actually consuming in the file? And it will also block you from using other stuff. So it's a nice way if you're coming into a new piece of code to understand what it's actually trying to do. In this case, I've just created a first name property on the component, put that to render in the template, and we're just putting it into the template we already had, and you'll see that that's already rendered. It's a bit of a naive example, though, because we might want to say override defaults. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to go through and override that to say other PhoneGap. And what this will do is override the default value that we had in the component to something else. You can probably start to see how we have some pretty unique data flows that we can play with here as well. Last thing I'm going to show you inside of a component is this computed property. If you've never dealt with these before, what this lets us do is start to concatenate different properties. When the video is over, I'll explain how this is different to an observer, which we also have. It's far more performant. So in this case, I'm defining a full name, which is dependent on the first name and last name property. And all I'm going to do is just return a concatenation of those two properties. And the reason we use a computed property instead of an observer is, like an observer, if any of the dependent keys change, it will cause the property to recompute and automatically propagate through Ember. The difference is that if nothing is dependent or bound to that computed property, it won't recompute until something is bound. So unlike an observer, you can drop as many of these as you need throughout your app and trust that they're actually not going to slow things down if they're being unused. Sometimes a bit of a gotcha for an Ember newbie who comes in and tries to inspect the state of their app and wonders why something's not triggering just yet. Second to last thing I'm going to show you in Ember is our data modeling. Because one of the other things that's really great here and will help you a lot with hybrid is that we actually don't even really think about how we communicate with the server. I hate to say it's probably been 1.5 years since I've actually written an AJAX request myself. I haven't even considered the transport protocol. Nor I've even really written my own serializers. This is actually first class in Ember. We have an assumption as to how you write your models. We have an assumption as to what your API looks like. We assume you're returning JSON API spec. You can override that if you want, but if you start doing that, you're going to get some really neat stuff that happens. So I'm going to go through and define the model. And the other reason we use Ember data is it actually gives us a global store that allows us to query, save, update, find records with a standard interface. And if you happen to work with something like a Rails or a Python, all of the serializers will work out of the box with this, so you almost do no work. So in this case, I'm going through and just creating a basic user model here. I'm not going to put a lot on it. I hope I come back and fix that red square. There we go. And I'm just going to create, a first name, which is an attribute of a string, and a last name, which is also an attribute of a string. And just so you can see how it works, because we also have our relationships out of the box from the API as well, what I'm going to do here is just say, a user has many messages. This is obviously going to break because I haven't defined messages yet. But just so you can see that if we formulate the right API responses, this all just loads straight in the Ember data store on your behalf. You never think about it. You never think about even, what did this look like on the way down? And to show you what that query might look like, I'm just going to go back to our route here. And in one of the standard Ember hooks, if you go to the API documentation, we have standard lifecycle hooks like everything else. In the model, I'm just going to return to every single user that we could find from the API. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to go through and query our API with the standard method. And I'm going to show you what that looks like as well. But all I'm doing here is making sure that that data is available to the template. You explicitly need to pass that through for performance reasons. And that binding, it's obviously not going to show much, but say we just wanted to output how many users we'd returned our new page. It's probably not the best sign-up process, but it is what it is. So to show you what the data requests actually look like, I'm going to give you an example of an action. Because so far we've gone through just, how do we set up a basic structure to render templates? How do we define what endpoints are in our app and start to cascade things? The last thing we really need to think about in our app is how do we handle user interaction? So Ember used to use what we called action bubbling. We've since taken some ideas from other frameworks and we use closure actions, which basically means we pass the function straight down into the component, the controller, whatever is actually calling it. That doesn't mean, though, that if you have a set of, say, 3 child routes with a parent, you can define an action of the same name and keep bubbling further up the stack. So this comes really handy if you have small permutations in the smallest child for what you want to do, but ultimately the action is the same, so you can start to put those across a few different files. So what I'm going to do here is just go and create a basic button, which on click is going to fire an action called save user. I'm just going to put some default information in there so you can see what this looks like. So it's going to fire an action called save user. It's going to go and look at its immediate parent for this action to be defined or to have been passed in. So I'm going to go back to the component and actually just write this action on here. It's not going to do much yet, but you're going to see how everything works. So what I'm actually going to do is construct a user record and try and save it to the API, and then you're maybe going to see how powerful this can be. First, though, I'm just going to make sure it worked. This is actually how I develop. I don't always debugger. I just console log everywhere. It's easier. It's faster. So we know that fired. Now I'm just going to go in and re-inject the store. The Ember store is available in your routes. If you'd like to use it in a component, you need to explicitly define that you're going to be using it. So I'm going to inject the store. We're going to just make it available inside of that action. Then I'm going to create a basic user. So we're going to create a record of user. This will only resolve because we already have a model that's called user. We're just going to do first name, last name, pretty basic stuff. And then we're just going to save it. And I'm going to go down and just show you how this fails so you can see how much Ember data is doing on your behalf. So I'm going to press save user even though there's no actual API. We have a bug, but if we go in and inspect the network tab, you'll see that just straight out of the box, that's gone and constructed a basic request, which is already compatible with JSON API spec and can be persisted by Rails right now. And just so you know it's real, we can go into our Ember inspector, see that the user's actually there if we want some debug information. We can even go down and look at, has the record been saved? Is it dirty? What's happened since the last time I interacted with it? So this just makes things really easy to get working. So now we've done a little bit with Ember, it's time to talk about making this work with Cordova. Because when I started working with Ember, I was both very attracted with it as a desktop framework, but I realized that actually this gives me a lot of structure and control for building hybrid apps. And the nice thing is because Ember is so structured, as a community, we can start to do some really interesting stuff on top of it. As an example, as an add-on author, there are automatic plugins that will go and test my add-on against every single version of Ember. I do nothing, it's a one-liner because we're all structured the same way. So Ember Cordova is a library for basically taking your Ember application and packaging it for Cordova. We have a custom CLI in there, so our users don't actually interact with the Cordova CLI very much. We directly consume the Cordova library instead. We actually have Livereload in that context as well. It will work on your device. Your device doesn't need to be plugged into anything. Our icon and splash generation is there as well. And we have a set of plugins. So we usually build stuff on top of existing Cordova plugins that are bound explicitly to work in Ember's format. And we have a bunch of standard installers there, so most of those are actually community contributed at this point. And just because I always get asked what we're not a UI library. We will tell you what frameworks you should use, but I honestly just have no interest in sitting there and writing stuff like that, and so far nobody else has offered to do it. So at the moment, we just tell people what they should use instead. The other thing here is we don't necessarily protect you from bad performance. This project is 1.5 years, 2 years old, so we haven't had a lot of time to go through and tell you explicitly when you're doing, say, something we think is leaky. The best we can do right now is tell you absolutely when your application won't work. Another important thing to note is we have a couple of differences to how stock Cordova works. we actually default initialize you with the WK web view versus UI web view, unless that's changed since the last time I looked at Cordova. Some other things is we default save plugins. We make an assumption that if you're running Ember install plugin, you want us to persist that on your behalf. Though I believe I saw a couple of weeks ago that became default in Cordova now as well, which makes me very, very happy. It was sometimes sad talking to people and realizing they didn't know they could actually save plugins in config XML, which is one of the reasons we took this approach. A lot of our users have actually never even used Cordova before. They don't even really know what it is, to be honest. I'm going to skip that one. We don't need a flame war today. So the last thing I'm going to talk about before we go into actually using Ember Cordova is, so how do we structure this to now work in hybrid? So our philosophy is that we actually, when we're recycling an app, and by recycling I mean I'm taking a desktop application and trying to make it work on hybrid, we re-implement the layout but not the components. And the reason we do this is when I get talking about reflow and stuff like that, we don't want a bunch of expensive content we're not using. And I find that you can go and write a bunch of responsive CSS. That's usually a disaster. It's hard to structure. For your index templates, usually for my top-level routes, I'll just go and rewrite the template but use the same bindings in terms of the routes and the controllers. This is actually done with a library called Flexi, which was built by a guy called Runspired. It's not his real name, while he was working with us. And what that lets us do is instead of having that template.hbs, you can still have that. But instead, what we do is we create a template called mobile.hbs and a template called desktop.hbs. And depending on what build pipeline we're running for, we'll selectively start to include the right templates on your behalf. So this is a really nice way to cut a lot of gunk out of your app that you're not intending on using, but we still want to use that 80% core code. This is a really nice approach to do that. You don't even need to use Ember Cordova for this. This will work if you're just building a web-based PWA as well. Now we have everything working, though. Let's go through and actually initialize Ember Cordova inside of that application. So within Ember, we have a standard installer for our add-ons. So we just run ember install Ember Cordova. This one actually wasn't bad Wi-Fi. I was stuck on a train. So again, the installer, I take videos in really weird spots. But you're going to see this go through. You'll see it default to Yarn if your Ember project is working on Yarn. Otherwise, it will work with NPM as well. That's just going to go through and actually create a Cordova project inside of Ember for us. So you'll notice in this example project here, if I can find the mouse, there we go. We have, oh, this is not my example project. I'll just show you on the next screen. All right, that screen is over here if you're wondering why I don't know how to operate a mouse right now. Before we do that, let's go back and actually run a build. So all I've done is I've installed Ember Cordova, and I just want to try and get it working. And you'll notice that we've already thrown a bunch of exceptions up on this screen. And this is us just going through and linting your Ember app for you and telling you what we know won't work in Cordova. There's a few things in Ember we don't necessarily have our root URL with a preceding slash, which is obviously a no-no in Cordova. And also the location type in Ember won't always be a hash, which is again going to have a preceding slash that we don't want. So we're just going to go through and actually make those changes inside of our Ember config. And then we're going to run a build again. So I'm going to get rid of that leading slash in my URL, and I'm going to change my location type to hash. Then we're going to go through and actually just try and build this basic app and see if we can get it working from Cordova immediately. So what's going on right now is Ember's build pipeline is running. It's going through, minifying my Ember stuff and spitting out the vendor CSS, vendor JS, and app name. And it's already ported through to now doing the Cordova build because we've copied those assets over. The same type of CLI you work with Cordova applies. You can see what platform you want, what provisioning profile you want. We have full coverage of the same options. It's not that hard to do. Since I've recorded this video, we've also made it so you can suppress a lot of that log output if it's not something that you want to see. So you're going to go through, and because that build takes a while, I'm just going to skip through to the next one. So that build succeeded, and we now just want to run it on something. So again, for the lazy, what we do is we just do Ember CDV open. You know you're a bad developer when you write a command to open Xcode for you to the project because you can't be bothered opening Xcode. So that's what's going on here. You can run Ember CDV run if you like as well, but I'm just going to go through and boot this app on the emulator, and we'll see that we're back to having that welcome page up already. So with basically no work, right, we just ran an Ember install. This is all working out of the box for us. Let's go back here. So the next thing we're going to start playing with is our icons. Because within Ember, we have icons in our web page, but we don't have icons inside of, say, we don't have a splash screen icon. So we have first class in our library, something to replace, as nice as that logo is, a basic image. So what we ask our users to do is just give us an SVG, right? One called splash and one called icon. And what you can do is just run this command called make splashes or make icons. And that's going to go through and resize that SVG, again, just using Ember's pipelines, and start replacing that inside the Cordova project on your behalf. So again, so much of what we do is we try and abstract people that are working with Ember from even really thinking about how that Cordova layer works until you actually need to think about it. So it's telling us that those splashes have been generated. And if we open the config, you'll see that it's actually just gone through and written all of that into config for us. This is written intelligently enough as well that it will make sure that we're not replacing stuff that was already there. You can see that that's already loaded into the Xcode project as well, so I'm not going to go through and show you the emulator there. Same thing applies to Splash as well. In the interest of time, though, I think I'm going to skip straight past that one. One of the things that's really fun, though, is that we don't want to keep going through that rebuild process, right, every time we make a small change inside of our Ember app. So Livereload almost comes free within this ecosystem because we already have a development server with Ember. So what I'm going to do is go and run this command called Ember CDVS, right, Ember Cordova serve. And this is going to go and build a basic shell app that's built to work with Livereload and actually make sure it's pointed to a running instance of our Ember server. So that's going to go through and do the build for us now. The actually shell container here is basically just a straight up IP redirect to something else on the network. It's a pretty simple implementation. And now we know our Livereload is enabled as well. So just through Xcode, I'm going to go and boot the emulator back up to this app. Put them next to each other so you can see what's going on. We have that wonderful splash that I generated before. And we have our basic Ember project there. So what I'm going to do is just go and make a basic change to what's going on inside here. So reopen that application template. Just get rid of the welcome page again, save it, and add a new header or something like that. And that's already gone through and just updated for us. That's going to work on a device as well. It's a really nice development flow. I basically only rebuild when I'm actually trying to do an archive or something like that. If you're wondering how that splash worked as well with something like this, if you notice when I was defining my routes, we have standard lifecycle hooks. So this is really nice because when we're initializing our application, we can actually really control and make sure Splash doesn't hide until not only Ember is initialized, but all of my data has initialized as well. So you can do that just by, as I said, our community has built a bunch of proxies for existing Cordova plugins. So you go and add Ember Cordova Splash. Then what I do in the application route is after model, basically once all of my AJAX requests have returned and my data's loaded in the store, then I hide the splash screen. It's a really nice way, again, basically no thought involved, to have something that's starting to feel native to our users. Just so you can start to see as well how we'd interact with some more broader Cordova concepts. Obviously in Cordova we emit events, right? Say the battery is low, the device is ready, something like that. So if you like, you can go through and actually use the standard Cordova bindings, or you can go and use the actual event bindings that we've written for you. This might look a little bit strange. It's also a bit of a convoluted example. What we're doing is we're doing basically a binding to battery low. The reason this is written this way is it will actually make sure that there are no memory leaks if you use our tool. We make sure that we handle the deallocation for you. Again, sometimes when I said that people write bad code, is they go and drop a bunch of listeners and never remove them and assume because they've changed the page or done something that listener is gone. Usually you've just lost access to it, but it's still sitting in the session. The phone's just getting hotter and hotter. So if you use these tools, it's going to save you a lot. And just an example, one of the guys at the company wrote a blog called The Real Reason to Avoid jQuery. And this is one of the things he was calling out, that if you actually don't go through Same would apply to React or Angular, and as a component is being deconstructed, make sure that your manual listeners are gone. They're going to hang around forever, and this is really bad form. Sometimes as we're doing this, though, we also get people who talk to us and say, well, I can't wrap things in a device ready because the device is already ready, what's going on? So I assume this is a bit more of a hybrid crowd, but if you didn't know, device ready is special case. So if the device is already fired, it's going to fire anyway, so you can safely drop that listener at any moment through your app. So that's a quick tour so far of both why we like Ember and how we handle building this into Cordova. So for the time I've got left, I'm just going to run through how we start making this feel native and how we start making this feel performant, which is something that we do in Ember, but no matter what type of hybrid you're writing, it will apply. First thing is ghost clicks, which is just a funny one to see. Once you've seen it before, you know what's going on. We tend to use a library called Hammer.js, if you've ever used it, which lets you detect taps, double taps, swipes, whatever you want. The thing you've got to be careful of, though, is if you go and drop a tap listener and don't drop your click listener, you're going to have some fun moments where things are firing twice, you're navigating all over the screen. It's what we call a ghost click. Just please be careful to make sure you're disabling click. Actually, usually the first thing I do when I'm creating a shell is I just globally disable click events inside the app. I actually don't use the polyfills for click to touch either, because a lot of the time we're wanting to manually control what's going on inside of our components. Another fun little one, I'm sure you had this in hybrid apps that you're doing, is you click a link inside the app, and then it goes blue. And that happens on a website, but it shouldn't happen inside of a hybrid app. So single CSS rule here, it's just going to make sure that links maintain whatever state was going on beforehand. One of my favorite ones as well is just, if we're trying to get good performance, is we need to know what reflow is. So quick show of hands, who here knows what DOM reflow is at all? Sweet, more than normal. So if you don't know what reflow is I guess before I go into the technical definition, it's the thing you don't want to be dealing with. And when it's happening, you want it to be as cheap as possible. And basically what's going on is we've gone through and we've resized the browser window. We've used a JavaScript computed method or a computed style. We've added or removed something from the DOM, or we've even just changed a class name. And what goes on under the hood is the browser, or in this case the Cordova browser, needs to go through and recompute what is where, what's going on, what do I look like. And sometimes people make the mistake of thinking that these changes are contained to the one node that we just changed. But because of the craziness, and I was going to say wonderful, but I can't even do it, of CSS, is that you can have rules all over the place. So it actually usually does need to go and walk the entire DOM tree up and down. And don't forget, we're dealing in a single-threaded environment here, so while that's happening, your animations are going to start janking all over the place, and nothing else is going to be going on. So sometimes what's going on is you'll see people say, go and do a computed animation where you're having an absolute position box and you're moving across the screen. People wonder why it's always janky no matter what they do. It's because in every single case you're reflowing, so you wouldn't possibly get a smooth animation no matter what you tried. So this is the experience. So to get around that, the first thing you want to start doing is thinking about CSS transforms. If you've never used them before, these are your translate X, translate Y, stuff like that. And the reason these are so special is you can use them and not reflow. So instead of, say, doing that naive animation before of changing a box's, position absolute, top left, top right, whatever we're doing, if you use the translate functions, you're basically guaranteed to not be reflowing in that case. One of the other things we see, though, is somebody now understands reflow, so they start deleting stuff on the page they're not using to make their reflow cheaper. But obviously, by deleting stuff, we just caused a reflow anyway. So if you need to temporarily remove something from the page, your actual best case is visibility hidden, which again is another special case that will make sure that nothing's going to change as we're working through. Just to give you an example of what that looks like as well, I'm actually going to do a jQuery animation here. If anybody doesn't know this page, it's from Velocity.js. It's quite solid for animations. Usually I'll store out my own CSS ones when I can, and I'll default to this when it's a bit trickier. So what this is going to do is it's just going to animate 250 dots going left and right across the screen. And you're seeing that we're already just with basic jQuery animate. We're having trouble doing that, and this is not that complicated of example. So what I'm going to do next is go through and actually use Velocity, which has much more performant animations, and run the same thing. Still not great, which is why we'd usually go to CSS if we need to, but we're already seeing a pretty big improvement there. So a really quick win is if you have jQuery animations everywhere, you've just written some bad stuff yourself, you'd find the velocity API is basically the same if you need it to be. So you can go through and just change the library that's handling your animations and get something much more performant under the hood. Running lower on time, so I'm just going to mention this very quickly, but if you want to have real fun, write animations framed for yourself. If you don't know what they are, come and ask me afterwards. One of the last things I want to talk about, though, is just our infinite scrolling, because this is really common to any type of hybrid application as well. What I find is that, again, people approach infinite scrolling. The worst way is they just go and dump everything on the page. That never works. And sometimes what you see is they come up with these crazy ideas, like I'm going to have a viewport here and just like move this entire DOM thing up and down. Doesn't really work either. So there's this library in Ember called Smoke and Mirrors. I'm sure there's one in your framework as well. If not, go and build it. You'll get a lot of stars pretty quickly. And it actually uses an occlusion. Stars are everything, guys. And it will actually use an occlusion-based scroll. If you're not familiar with what an occlusion-based scroll is, it basically makes sure that the things that aren't on the page are not rendering anywhere on the DOM. We basically go through and keep rehydrating the same fragments as somebody's scrolling. So, give you an idea, this is just an example using Smoke and Mirrors where we're just jamming several thousand records into a table at once and forcing it to keep scrolling, and it's not going to give up. We're not going to have any memory leaks. We're not really going to increase any type of performance stats. Reason this matters as well is if you're not familiar, the more memory you're using, the slower your application's going to start running. If you're not really familiar with why there's a trade-off to, as you might have 200 megs, you shouldn't use it, it's a really good paper there that will maybe give you an introduction as to why memory management matters, even though you're working in JavaScript. It's really easy to figure out if you've never done it, by the way. Pop open Xcode, and you'll actually see how much is being consumed. On that note as well, one of the things that we see hybrid developers running into is their app will start to garbage collect. And as it's garbage collecting, they don't know what's going on. So again, I'm running a bit lower on time, but the important thing to know about this is there are basically two types. You have your young generation and your old generation. So imagine when you have a variable that's not being used anymore, it sits in the young generation, and it will eventually be cleared out of there. But variables that are still being used for quite a while will eventually shift to the old generation. So your young generation is almost always flushing. And sometimes what will happen is you've done no animation, you've changed nothing, but you're still getting a bit of a jank somewhere. And basically what's going on is your garbage collector is kicked in. And you can't really control when that's going to happen. What you can start doing is write defensive coding to make sure that it doesn't need to happen as much. So one of the fun examples we show everybody is, say in this case, we have var node, which references some node on the page, then we have node again. Then we have our body, and the first thing at line 4 is I go and actually remove the node child. So you'd think at this point we're good, right? We've actually cleared up the memory that was being used. That's actually not the case. It doesn't exist on the DOM anymore, but it's still there, right? We still have pending references to what's going on there. So at line 5, we'll go and null the node variable. It's still there because we still have a pending reference to what was going on. We've actually not completely cleared up that allocation until at the final line we remove all references to what was going on. So if you've never done this before, make sure, especially as you're, say, binding through jQuery to a DOM node, that you're nulling those elements at the end. This is why earlier when I said that if you use the stuff we write in Ember Cordova, it will make sure all of that's deallocated on your behalf. That's why we've written the listeners in the way that we have. If you're curious as well, we never profiled this, just pop open your Chrome developer tools. You can do your CPU profiling, or you can just take a heap snapshot as well and kind of see what's going on. If you've never done it before, it'll be really confusing the first time you look, but it's actually quite interesting to start to play with. You're going to get an output like this, and this is going to show you what's going on. And you'll notice there it's already alerting me stuff that's actually detached. Right? In this context, detached basically means that I don't think it's being used, but I have to keep it. And last point I'm going to make, because we're going through screens like this, is in JavaScript we have this habit of using closure functions that we don't name. And that's really good right now, but when we're actually running through our debuggers and trying to figure out what's going on, they all show as completely anonymous functions. So I stole this example from Google, but it doesn't matter. And what we can actually do is, you'll notice here, we're creating large closure. And if you notice at the first one at line 3, we just have var lc equals function. So in any profile, that's going to show up as completely anonymous. But what you'll notice is at line 11, we've actually called it function lc. So now as we're tracing that function through our profiler, we can start to trace what was lc, what was going on there. So you may not always want to ship this to production, but it's a nice way to see what's going inside your app. Thank you very much for getting through that. I have 22 seconds left, so if somebody wants to ask a question really quickly, now would be the time.
Awesome. Thank you for finishing on time. That was great.